Hello everyone, I'm Gizmat, and welcome to my first video in a new series I'm doing called Mechanics Dismantled, where I take an in-depth look at various mechanics from video games, tabletop games, card games and more. This video will be focusing on the concept of health, whether it be health bars, hit points, hearts, life, energy, or whatever. Health is arguably one of the most widespread mechanics in video game history, ever. But how did it begin? Who first came up with the idea of having a number to represent one's proximity to death, and why is it so unanimous in so many different games? Well, let's start with the basics. In any game of any kind, you'll need to know when a player has failed. This is true for any kind of game, even really old ones. Checkmates in chess, crossing the top line in Tetris, or playing an army that isn't Space Marines in Warhammer. Though these can have extremely complex gameplay, with the possible exception of Warhammer, it is totally feasible to quantify how close a player is to losing the game at any given point. Indeed, that's what much of the strategy revolves around, judging how close you are to losing and adjusting your playstyle to either claw back the lead or maintain it as long as you can. Loads and loads and loads of both video and tabletop games centre around a human, or at least living, protagonist, and thus it seems logical that the way we would quantify failure in that game is by a player's character dying. But how did the concept of health first come about? Well, the first incarnation of health, in the sense we understand it, was as hit points. Sound familiar? It will to some of you, because it was devised as a mechanic for the incredibly successful tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons, when it was still in its development. D&D's creator, Gary Gygax, produced a game called Chainmail in 1971, which was a fantasy battle game that let players take control of small squads of characters and soldiers to do battle in a fantasy setting. Gygax reckoned that with smaller armies, players could be able to get into their characters' heads more, and get more invested in the battle storyline overall. There was a problem though. In Chainmail, when one character went into a combat with another character, 2 dice were rolled to determine the outcome of the fight. Either the attacker could die, or the defender could. The exact numbers were dependent on a lot of things, including armor and weapon types, but nonetheless it was entirely possible for your character to die after just one bad roll. It sometimes felt a little frustrating and unfair to players have their favourite characters suddenly up and down on them just because of an unfortunate roll, especially if they had a good chance of winning the fight in the first place. They hadn't even made a tactical error, and they were being punished for it. So, when Dungeons & Dragons rolled around, no pun intended, its co-creator Dave Arneson came up with the concept of hit points to rectify this issue, a method of tracking how close a character was to death so that the player could adjust their strategy accordingly, rather than having to take a blind chance and hoping they didn't roll snake eyes. The mechanic itself was based on a couple of other games, notably the naval fighting game Ironclads. In this game, players could take out individual pieces of the opponent's ships one by one, so that they could survive a few hits before being totally destroyed. This was built on by Arneson and applied into a more generic context, until eventually he produced the famous hit point. And thus, the hit point was born, a discrete measurement of how close you are to death, incredibly simple, but with vast potential to be expanded on in different ways. Bigger things can have more hit points, different weapons can inflict different amounts of armor, and there was potential for healing spells and potions by having you recover your lost hit points. Video games, and particularly arcade games, of the time, developed this idea more or less alongside the realm of tabletop games. Shortly after the release of Dungeons & Dragons in 1974, the idea was adopted by many video game companies due to its sheer simplicity and expandability. The game widely credited with the popularization of the health bar as we know it today was Dragon Buster, released in 1985. Before these advancements, games had largely relied on a lives system. One mistake alone will kill you, but you have several chances to complete that part before a total game over, which in reality is a very similar thing to hit points, a discrete measurement of how close one is to failure. They work slightly differently, sure, but they had the same core idea behind them. During the late 80s and through the 90s, the health bar really took off. What with the Unreal Tournament, Half-Life, Final Fantasy and so many other successful games, it really got around. Even the original 1993 Doom and its predecessor Wolfenstein 3D, largely considered to be 2 of the most important video games in the history of the medium, featured it as a central mechanic. Nowadays, the idea of health is so intrinsic to the function of so many games that it's hard to imagine it not being there. Like a little familiar friend in the bottom left corner of our UI, scribbled down on our character sheets or floating above our head. It's always there to remind us of our own mortality. Of course, not all games use it in quite the same way. Super Smash Bros. Is perhaps the most famous example of a modern game with no standard health system. In fact, the damage a character takes is converted into knockback that all subsequent attacks inflict. Some more narrative-focused games, The Walking Dead for example, portray a character's injuries and physical collapse through the storytelling, so that even if there's no number on the screen, you have an idea of how vulnerable they are. Again, this is like having health without health, a method of a player determining how near they are to failure so that they may act accordingly. All in all, measuring how close a player is to failure is an intrinsic element of any game. It's arguably what makes a game that. A game. The constant struggle between success and failure, and being able to adjust your strategy depending on how you're currently doing. In some way, be it the intricacies of a chessboard, the arrangement of Tetris blocks currently stacked up, or how much health you have remaining, a game is about judging what you have and trying to come out on top no matter what. I've been Carpin Gizmat, and thanks for joining me on the first episode of Mechanics Dismantled. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below suggesting which mechanic I should cover next. I have a few ideas lined up, but I'm more than open to suggestions. Bye for now.